Hello and welcome to another interesting video from the channel Microtechie. In this video, we are going to talk about the last member of the what if analysis tools family, data table. Without much ado, let's get into the Excel screen and let's try to explore how to use this tool in a better way. Alright, now I am in the Excel screen which with the same example which I have used for the scenario manager, and the data table is also exactly similar to the scenario manager, where you would be aware of how much change you're going to do it on the input side, and you want to know what that individual changes are creating an impact on the output side. So now, what is the advantage of data table compared to the scenario manager when both are doing the same job? Now let me give you a small example. Now let's say I want to vary the subparameter 1.3 by 0.5 right from 24 to 30. So 24, 24.5, 25, 25.5, 26, 26.5, like that up to 30 I want to go, and for each of that 0.5 difference in that parameter value, I want to know what is the impact going to happen on the output side. Now remember that literally we have to go more than 6 or 7 different changes here. In case if you're going to use scenario manager, that means you got to create that much scenario. For every single change you got to create one scenario. So if the number of changes which you're going to make it on the input are limited, then yes, scenario manager is absolutely a go for tool. But let's say if you're going to do a variation on the input, multiple variations, let's say 10 variations or 20 variations, and you want to know what is an impact for each of the variation, I cannot sit and create 20 scenarios or 15 scenarios, and that is the time the data table comes into play. Yeah, so let us see how do we use the data table, and there is a kind of a setup which you need to do in order to make this tool to work for you. Now first thing, let's go with this example here. I want to know what changes happens for every 0.5 difference right from 24 to 30 for the subparameter 1.3. Now the first question is, where are you going to place that variations? Yeah, are you going to place them in the row pattern? Are you going to place them in the column pattern? Now what do I mean by that? So the question here is, are you going to place something like this, or are you going to place something like this? So that's the question, because the way you're going to place your variation is actually going to tell you which option in the data table you got to use. Because if you go to data table, let me show you here. I go to data tab, forecast group, what if analysis, data table. You got two boxes here to work with. So the question is, are you placing them in a row pattern? Are you placing them in a column pattern? So that's something which you got to do. If you're placing them in a row pattern, you will be using row input cell. If you're placing them on the column pattern, you will use the column input cell. Yeah, so that is very important. Now the second thing which you got to know is, when you decided to do that change, so let's say for example I love to go ahead and do it on the row wise. So the way you got to do it is, right after the formula cell, one row to the top, one column to the right. Let me repeat it. If you decided to place them on one row, then you got to place that variation in such a way, one row above and one column to the right from the formula cell. Okay, so this is my formula cell, and one row above, one column to the right, and I'm going to start feeding the variations. So 24.00, 24.5, 25, 25.5. So we could select these two and we keep dragging them. So we're going to keep moving until it finishes up to 30. There we go. So we got up to 30 right now. So from the formula cell, one row above, one column to the right from where you got to start. So once you've done that setup, now you got to select like this, the changes and the formula. So you might ask, why are we selecting this? So that is not going to create any kind of an impact. So the Excel is going to focus on this and this. So now after selecting your formula cell and the varied inputs like this, you got to go to the what if tools and you got to pick up the data table. Now it's going to ask you, hey, out of all the inputs in the table, which is that input which you have varied and kept it in the row wise? So in our case, it's the subparameter 1.3. That's the input I have varied and kept it in a single row. And if I click OK, and it's going to show you what is the impact for each of those changes. That's what you're looking at. Okay. Now, similarly, when you want to use the column input cell, so you got to do something like this. So let's say 24, and I want to see for 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. So for every 1 unit variation, I want to study. So when you want to place it in a column, then you got to place it one column to the left, one row down, exactly opposite to the row input setup. From the formula cell, one column to the left, one row below. That's where you have to start varying that input which you want to vary. So once that is done, now select along with your formula area and the varied input kept cell, go back to what if analysis data table, and this time instead of using row input you will use column input, and again you have to say which is that input in the entire calculation which you're trying to vary and keep it in the column wise, which is subparameter 1.3. I want to select that and click OK, and that is going to perform and show it to you. This is what the impact it is going to do. Yeah. So the example what I've shown you is either when you want to keep one row or either you want to keep it as one column where you change one of the input and you see the impacts on the output. Now, let's say that you want to change more than one input, not one input at a time. You want to do 2 inputs at a time. So how do you do the setup in that case? So let me show you how do you do that. Yeah? Suppose you desire to vary 2 inputs. So let's say I want to vary the subparameter 2.1 and the 3.1 for every 0.5. So let's say 22, 22.5, and I want to select this and keep dragging it. Okay, here I'm going to do it for the subparameter let's say subparameter subparameter 3.1. So 2.1 we have varied and kept here, 3.1 we are trying to vary. So 26, 26.5, select them and drag it. So now what I want to study is if the subparameter 3.1 is 26 and if the 2.1 is 22, what's my output? Similarly, if it is 26 here, subparameter 3.1, if it is 26.5 and if it is 22.5, what's the impact? So for every combination, I want to know the impact on the output. So what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to select right from the formula cell till all the areas where I have got my inputs typed, and I go to the data tab, forecast group, and then we're going to go for data table. This time I'm using 2 variables. I'm varying them and keeping it row wise as well as column wise. So row wise, the input which I varied and kept is 2.1, and column wise which I varied and kept is 3.1. When I click OK, that's going to show you what is the impact for each of the combination. Imagine, my friend, if scenario manager is your only call, that means you would have created literally almost 77 different scenarios. Yeah. So because the number of outputs what we see is 77, so for each of these impact you would have created one scenario. So 77 scenarios would have been created, but that effort is taken care by the data table. Yeah. And the output what you're getting is not editable because it's a part of array. Okay, because data table results will be an array kind of a formula. So when you want to work on them or do something on them, copy paste them as values and you can start working. There is only one drawback when it comes to data table. The drawback is max to max you can vary only 2 inputs at a time, not more than that. That's a huge restriction. Yeah. So if you want to do it for more, so obviously you have to go for the scenario manager only. There is no other go. Yeah. So that's the only limitation in this particular tool. Rest of it is all perfectly fine. So let me repeat it. When you're varying only 1 input You decide whether you want to keep that variation on the single row or a single column. If it's a single row, one column to the right and one row above. If it's a single column, one column to the left, one row below. And then start putting your changes. But remember, this reference, one column to the right, one column to the left, all I'm talking about is with reference to the formula cell, the final formula cell. Now similarly, when you're going to do both, then make sure your formula is in the left hand side intersection point.